Hi, everybody. My name is Hiro Yoshikawa. I'm a professor of education and the academic dean here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Thanks so much for coming to our Ask With forum tonight. It's a real honor for me to introduce this panel tonight, which is not only on a topic that is of persistent importance in American society, which is economic and educational inequality, but happens to be in the news multiple times a day in recent weeks with a new social movement associated with it. So we're at a point in our history where we really need good empirical data, the best researchers in the country to be thinking about and describing the patterns of educational and economic inequality in our country, but also telling us what the most promising solutions might be. And so I think the timing of this book in terms of the pressing nature of this issue in the United States and its urgency and its potential really to inform policy in a new way based on the kind of mass interest in it is unprecedented. It's also particularly a pleasure for me to introduce the panel because they have been mentors to me and to generations of students and researchers of the economics of education and child development in this country. So we're very lucky to have Greg Duncan and Dick Murnane, who are the editors of this wonderful book, Whither Opportunity, from the Russell Sage Foundation, which draws together the leading researchers in the country to examine the different contextual roots of educational and economic inequality. And we also have a third leader in the field of inequality over the past several decades, Sandy Jencks here, who will provide comments on the book. Let me say a little bit more about each of our panelists, and then we'll get quickly to the presentations themselves. So Greg Duncan, an economist by training, is Distinguished Professor in the Department of Education at the University of California, Irvine. And he is an expert in many different areas, but centrally around the economics of human development, issues of income dynamics and distributions, poverty, welfare and employment policy, and child development. So, and all I can say as a developmental psychologist interested in issues of poverty and policy and child development is that there is none of us who match that demographic who Greg is not willing to mentor. And this goes far beyond his home institutions to the field as a whole. He was president of the Population Association of America in 2008, president of the Society for Research in Child Development between 2009 and 2011, a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, a member of the National Academy of Education and the National Academy of Sciences. Richard Murnane, an economist also by training, is the Thompson Professor of Education and Society here at the Harvard Graduate School of Education, and again has mentored generations of students, not only here but at many other top research institutions around many of the central issues in the economics of education. So for example, he's examined the shifting skill demands in the US economy with colleagues Frank Levy and David Autor. He has multiple books on that topic of skill development and skill demands shifting over the course of the 20th century and to the present day. And he has recently completed a book with our colleague John Willett called Methods Matter, Improving Causal Inference in Educational and Social Science Research. And then our discussant, Christopher Sandy Jencks, is the Malcolm Wiener Professor of Social Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, and again has led research and mentorship in the area of social inequality writ large in the United States for several decades. And has conducted groundbreaking work on the costs and benefits of economic inequality, and the role of education in addressing inequality, with books including The Academic Revolution, Rethinking Social Policy, The Black-White Test Score Gap, and The Homeless. So what we're going to hear now is presentations by Greg and Dick of the book, and then discussing comments by Sandy. Then we'll have some time for open questions and answers. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Hiro. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. I had almost nothing to do with this project for quite a bit of its life, and am building on the shoulders of giants. Becky Blank was the originator of this project. Both Eric Wiener of the Russell Sage Foundation and Mike McPherson of the Spencer Foundation were interested in the question of inequality as it affects second generation kind of outcomes. We know a lot about inequality now and how much it's increased over the last 30 years. I'll have some data about that. But people haven't extended the inequality debate to intergenerational dimension. What are the implications for kids, and what role do schools have in the effects of inequality on second generation outcomes? So that's really what the project was about, and Becky started this up, what, 5 years ago. Had a number of meetings to try to conceptualize what the lay of the land looked like and what a book might look like. She knew that when she saw that schools were going to be an important part, that she needed someone like Dick Murnane on board, and he quite willingly, I hear, joined the project. And then Becky went off to serve in the Commerce Department of the Obama administration, is still there. And I was asked to join in. It was about 2/3 of the way through, and trying to corral all the authors into writing the chapters that we hoped they would write rather than the chapters that they wanted to write. I don't know if how many of you have written chapters for volumes, but you get this discussion with the editor, and you kind of think, oh yeah, I've got a paper, it's kind of descriptive, I can't really publish it in a journal anywhere, why don't I just try to stick it in this volume? And then when you're an editor, you think, well, we've got to cover all these kind of areas, and we need to cover it in this kind of way. So we want you to write about this particular topic in this particular way. So there was a lot of back and forth with a number of the authors. Most of them were exceedingly cooperative. But it was 25 chapters, right? And something like 50 authors and co-authors altogether. So it was a long time in the making, but it finally came out in September, and it's finally available on Amazon.com in November. So let me tell you about the book. That's the cover. It actually is a joint product of Russell Sage and the Spencer Foundation. And it's bringing both inequality and schools into this intergenerational kind of question. So let me just set the stage and make sure we all are on the same page in our understanding of what's happened to the income distribution over the last 60 years. It's convenient to divide this period up into two 30-year periods. Let's start just after World War II. 1947 was the first year that the Census Bureau started gathering data systematically every year in the current population survey. They talked to a large national sample of families and figure out what family income distribution looks like. So here we just divide the income distribution into the bottom 20%, that income amount that separates the bottom 20% from the top 80% of families. That income in today's dollars is about $13,000 back in 1947. The top 20%, that dividing line was about 3 times that amount, about $40,000 per year. Incomes were much lower, real incomes back then. And then the top 5% had a threshold of about $70,000. So that was the income that separated the top 5% from everybody else. And if we start everyone out at the same point and ask by how much did incomes in these different cut points grow over the next 30 years, you see tremendous growth really at all points of the income distribution. So GNP per capita over this period approximately doubled. The incomes separating the bottom 20% from the top 80% approximately doubled from $13,000 to $26,000. The income separating the top 20% from the bottom 80% doubled from about $40,000 to 80-some thousand dollars. And also at the top, the income distribution, the top 5%, incomes doubled there from about $70,000 to $145,000. Notice there were times in the late 60s, for example, when the bottom 20% had actually had growth rates that were higher than the top 5% or the top 20%. The shaded areas on this graph show the recessions, official recessions. So you can see that incomes do drop during the recession periods. But by and large, the ups and downs of recessions are just waves on top of this much more fundamental tidal force over this period that brought everyone's incomes up to about twice the level that they were back in 1947. So that's the story up until the late 70s. If we look at the next period, we get a very different story, right? So first we're covering some of the first graph going from 1970 to 1979. We saw that on the earlier graph. Things were tangled up. Things were growing about at the same rate. And here we're starting 1979 at 100, right? This is the 26, the 70, and the $140,000 incomes. And we're seeing what happened over the next 30 years. Notice the scale is quite different. It's not 2.0 at the top, it's 1.4. So overall, nobody in these three groups did as well in these 30 years as in the first 30 years. The top 1%, I've noted that at the very top, they did just fine. Their incomes more than doubled. 2.69 is the factor by which they increased. But you can see these very different fortunes for families toward the bottom end of the distribution, the income separating the bottom 20% from the top 80%. That real income was often less in the 80s than it was back in 1979. The growth years during the Clinton administration, the 1990s, were a very positive one for all three groups, so incomes grew quite a bit over that period. In the 2000s, despite overall growth, you had kind of a wobbling around for the top 20% and the top 5%. The bottom 20% did very badly, and then of course the most recent severe recession hurt everyone, and especially the bottom 20%. Right? So when people talk about rising tides lifting all boats, they're talking about the first 30 years. And when people talk about how much inequality has increased, they're talking about the most recent 30 years. Notice we're not talking about the top 1% versus the bottom 99%. There's probably a separate story for what went on at the very, very top. We're focusing in the book on the much broader set of families in the top 20%. 20 million kids approximately live in the top 20% of income families, and 20 million live in the bottom 20%. So their fortunes have diverged substantially over the last 30 years. What have been the consequences of that divergence for their attainment outcomes? If you ask what's happened over the last 30 years, economists have studied this quite a bit and have come to a consensus that technological change played a fundamental role. For much of the 20th century, it was favoring low-skilled workers as much as high-skilled workers. In the last 30 years, there's been this bias in technological change, especially computer-driven, that's favored more highly skilled workers, especially workers with college educations. Globalization, this is all the deindustrialization story that we know so much about. Other things have been going on at the same time. Fraction of the labor force over the last 30 years unionized has dropped in half. Minimum wage has fallen in half in real terms. The fraction of the labor force that is immigrant has doubled. And then there are these other non-economic demographic changes that have taken place, like the rise of single-parent families. Most important is really the first two items on this list. If you look at what's happened to real wages of high school graduates versus college graduates, you see that high school graduate wages have gone down in real terms pretty consistently over the last 30 years. Real wages of college graduates have gone up. So the wage divergence has really driven a lot of the income divergence, but it certainly hasn't helped that single-parent families have become much more frequent as well, along with these other changes. So that story is pretty well known, but it's the intergenerational linkages that isn't so well known, and that's really what the book is about. So I'm going to cover the patterns of children's achievement and attainment over this 30 years, and talk about family influences, and then Dick is going to talk about school influences. As a backdrop, if we think about this 30-year period in the context of the last century, Claudia Gold and Larry Katz have a wonderful book about schooling and inequality and technological change over the whole 20th century. The 20th century was the American century, and it was the American century in large part because of the growth in educational attainment of the workforce. The U.S. was always a leader in first universal primary schooling, universal secondary schooling. University educations were made more universally available in the U.S. Quicker than in any other country. So you had this unrelenting, wonderful increase in completed schooling in the entire population that stalled out around 1970. Okay, and we're not going to claim that inequality has caused the entire stall out, but you can see that things have fundamentally changed in the last 30 years, and we really have to understand what is it that's behind this stalling out. The dropout rates, if anything, have increased a little bit over the last 30 years. And I'll show some data on college graduation rates. Things have picked up a little bit most recently, but it's still very much, and especially so for girls rather than boys, females rather than males. But this stall is a serious concern for the U.S., and we'll have some comparative data about how the U.S. has fallen behind in terms of its schooling levels. So that's the backdrop. What has income had to do with this? One of our chapters by Martha Bailey and Sue Dynarski takes data from a couple of large longitudinal surveys and tracks kids who turned 14 either in 1975 to 78 or 1993 to 1996. And it's information where you know not only what kind of education they eventually attained, but you also know what the family incomes were when people were ages 14 to 16. So you can take parental family income, divide kids up into the bottom, in this case 25% rather than top 25%. We tried to get them to do bottom 20% versus top 20%, but they were resistant because Jim Heckman did it 15 years ago, and that's the way they wanted to do it, so that's the way they did it. But it's almost quintiles, it's quartiles. But it's a pretty striking differential story. Kids whose family incomes were in the bottom quartile of the income distribution, their graduation rates were 5% in 1975-78, that cohort. That increased, it almost doubled to 9%, but it was still an incredibly low fraction of college graduation among kids in the bottom 20%. At the top, very different story. Those rates started at 33% and went up to 54%. So you get this very substantial increase in the gap between college graduation for high and low income kids. Another chapter by Sean Reardon did this same kind of analysis for test scores. I remember at one of our planning conferences, he said, oh, I'm going to take the 14 national data sets that have information on test scores and family incomes, and I'm going to put together this big time series. And we smiled, and it was a very ambitious goal, and he pulled it off. He really managed to produce this very coherent story from these very different data sets tracking over the last 30 or 40 years what test scores look like between kids in the top of the distribution versus the bottom distribution. So let me present those data by first presenting data on the black-white test score gap. This is a more familiar kind of trend, I think, for many of us. And it got me thinking, if the black-white test score gap is falling, how can the income-based test score gap be increasing? So this is just from the NAEP, the National Assessment of Education Progress Surveys. Over this period, starting in around 1970, of the advantage of whites over blacks on an SAT type scale. So standard deviation 100. So whites had more than a 1 standard deviation test score advantage over blacks around 1970. That fell quite substantially over the next 20 years or so. The black test scores were rising more quickly than the white test scores. This is the time when southern schools were desegregated and northern schools to some extent. And the quality of schooling for blacks increased substantially, and the test score gap fell accordingly. Since about 1990, things have bounced around a little bit, not much of a trend, but overall, over this whole period, you have quite a substantial drop in the black-white gap. The income gap takes a totally different course, right? Here, back around 1970, you had less than a 1 standard deviation gap between kids. In Sean's analysis, he was comparing the 90th percentile kids to the 10th percentile kids in the income distribution. He did that consistently across time. That was about 0.8 of a standard deviation back around 1970, and it's grown to over standard deviation now. So back in 1970, the black-white gap was much larger than the high-low income gap. Now it's just the reverse. All right? So the kind of story that you get from both the college graduation rates as well as these test scores show this increasing gap between the attainment and achievement of low-income kids relative to high-income kids. We had another analysis using still another data set which looked at completed schooling, total years of completed schooling, and you get this same kind of picture of an increasing gap over this period. So what are the causal linkages? That's really the question here. And just because test score gaps have increased at the same time income inequality has increased doesn't mean that income inequality has caused the test score gaps. So a fundamental challenge for the book is try to construct a story that, to what extent can we construct a story that's really a causal story? And there are reasons to wonder whether there are any causal linkages. After all, this is a time when there was tremendous demographic change, many more single-parent families. Single-parent families are concentrated among low-skill mothers and fathers. Maybe that, which is happening at the same time, is what really accounts for the education differences. So it's not at all obvious that it's income. The book is all about different pieces of the process that might link income inequality to children's educational attainment. And there are chapters on what's happened to families over this time. There are chapters about what's happened to school functioning, neighborhoods, labor markets. But we end up thinking that the story involves a combination of changes in families as well as changes in school functioning. And let me tell the family part of this story. In a very simplified way, the family story is really one of family income inequality affecting kids' attainment in two ways. One is what money can buy, the kind of increasing gap in resources available to high and low income kids. If income has a causal effect on kids' achievement and attainment, then that increasing gap is going to have a corresponding impact on schooling outcomes. When developmental psychologists talk about the family income effects, they have a rather different story about the stresses caused by constrained economic circumstances affecting parent-child relationships, which in turn have a negative impact. So it turns out there's evidence for both pieces of these parts of the story. One of the bits of data that we could put together were from consumer expenditure surveys over this 30-year period, where you can separate kids into the bottom 20%, upper 20%, and with the consumer expenditure surveys, you can actually track what sort of money they're spending on so-called enrichment activities. Okay, these are childcare, computers, private school tuition, if they send their kids to private schools. So whole books, a whole collection of things that might be considered to be enrichment expenditures. And if you use a consistent definition of what enrichment expenditures are over this period, what you see is this tremendous increase in the difference between what low-income and high-income families are spending on behalf of their kids. Despite the income stalling out, low-income kids did enjoy somewhat higher annual family expenditures, $1,315 as opposed to $835 back in 1972-73. These are all in current dollars. But the top-end expenditures have gone up by more than a factor of 2, from about $3,500 to almost $9,000, right? So if income has any causal impact on kids' outcomes, then you'd expect these kind of expenditures to really play out to the advantage of high-income kids relative to low-income kids. I'm putting what money can buy as a label here to be in contrast to Susan Mayer's book entitled What Money Can't Buy, which is all about why income isn't important for kids' outcomes. But I think if you look at the evidence from studies conducted over the last 10 years or so since her book came out, it's a pretty consistent story, either through genuine experiments like the negative income tax experiment, welfare to work experiments in the 1990s, or quasi-experimental studies where people have taken increases in the earned income tax credit over the 1990s and linked it to test scores to try to see to what extent families in a position to receive relatively larger increases in the earned income tax credit had kids whose test scores were increasing relatively more. And there's a paper coming out that shows that there are indeed those linkages. There's another paper that does the same thing in Canada, because the Canadian child benefit increased substantially around the year 2000. And if you do a careful kind of analysis of that, it seems to be associated with increases in test scores. So you can put together a story where at least some of the increase in gap in test scores and achievement is a function of what money can buy. The increasing gap in incomes have led to an increasing gap in expenditures, which lead to an increasing gap in attainment. What about the developmental psychology kind of story? It's harder to come up with experiments, either natural experiments or quasi-experiments, to look at that. There's a very interesting paper by Bill Evans and Craig Garthwaite that uses this earned income tax credit methodology, where you're trying to look to see whether the increases in the ITC over the 1990s is associated with better outcomes as reported by mothers and as revealed in the biomarkers taken by mothers in some of the national health surveys that have been conducted. And sure enough, mothers in a position to profit relatively more from this increase in the earned income tax credit report better mental health, and they report lower levels of risky biomarkers like C-reactive protein, which is one of the stress biomarker that's associated with bad health later on. So there's really, there's some support, it's rather indirect, that the increased stresses of low-income families relative to high-income families, where the gap is increasing, that might be accounting for part of it too. So combined, this what money can buy, as well as the stress and parenting kind of part of the story, seem to be a plausible set of pathways for why income inequality works through families to affect kids' educational attainments. The school story is told by my colleague, Dick. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. It's a pleasure to be among friends talking about this work that Greg and I have done over so many years. Some of you were in a seminar that I gave several years ago in which you read early drafts of these papers. I encourage you to read the papers that appeared in the volume. They're very different species and much, much better. The school story. So as we have thought about this and put structure on this issue, we have thought about it in terms of a model in which the primary way that increases in income inequality have affected schools is through their impact on residential segregation by income. And a nice paper Sean Reardon and a student of his have published in the American Journal of Sociology. They show that there was substantial increase in inequality by income during the 1980s, and that has not dissipated in subsequent decades. So a consequence is that children from low-income families are less likely today to attend schools with children from more affluent families than was the case 30 years ago. And it similarly would be true for higher income children not attending schools with low income children. Now, why does that matter? First of all, that we've been able to document. There's a nice paper by Joe Altonji and Rick Mansfield showing this increase in residential segregation by income in the volume. So increasing school segregation by income, that is isolation of poor kids in particular schools. Why does that matter? Well, as we see it matters through at least three mechanisms. One is our peer behaviors, second is student turnover, and the third is teacher quality. And there are papers in the volume about all three of these mechanisms. So what about peer behavior? So this is a diagram taken from a chapter that Greg wrote with Catherine Magnuson. And basically it's examining the student body composition of high-income schools, and they're schools in which fewer than 5% of the children are eligible for free and reduced lunch, with the student body composition of low-income schools defined as schools in which at least 50% of the children are eligible for free and reduced lunch. And this is evidence from a kindergarten. So you see that almost 40% of the children in low-income schools have achievement as kindergartners that lies in the bottom quarter of the nation's distribution of achievement for kindergartners. And in contrast, only 10% of kids in high-income schools fall into that low achievement category. Again, on teachers' reports, you see big differences in attention problems. A much higher percentage of children in low-income schools have attention problems as reported by their classroom teachers than was the case for kids in high-income schools, and similarly differences in teacher reports of behavior problems. The one reason this matters is there's increasing evidence from a variety of studies showing that being in a class in which your peers in the class have either low achievement or attention problems or behavioral problems leads to less achievement for the individual kids. And you can think of this, one important mechanism is simply the reduction in instructional time available when you have to spend a lot of time working on classroom management issues. So there just is less instructional time available in classrooms in which there are kids who exhibit particularly attention problems and behavioral problems, and kids from low-income families are much more likely than kids from high-income families to be in classrooms with those characteristics. So that's the peer group story. Then the second is student turnover. There's a nice paper in the volume by Steve Raudenbush and two of his students at the University of Chicago that looks at the student turnover among elementary schools in Chicago. And it has several findings. The first is that student turnover, this is new children entering the class during the school year, is much more prevalent in schools attended by African American children, dominated by African American children, and children from low-income families than is the case in schools that have a more affluent student body composition. Also, he shows that being in a school in which student turnover is very high leads to lower mathematics achievement for all kids, not only the kids who move, but also the kids who don't move. And again, the mechanism for that, one mechanism for that is, again, reduction in time available for instruction. If you have a new child entering in many of these classrooms, there are as many as a child entering every 3 or 4 weeks. The teacher has to figure out what reading group does the child belong in, has to spend time in socializing that child to the classroom norms of behavior. All that takes time that detracts from time available for instruction. So you find that in classrooms in which there's a high number of children entering the school entering the class during the school year, mathematics achievement is lower, and the impact is particularly large for low-income children and African American children. And third, teacher quality. Now, I think as probably everybody in this room knows, one of the kind of dominant findings of school effects is what every parent knows. That is, teacher quality varies enormously and has a huge impact on what the amount our children learn in school. And we've known for a number of years from a number of studies that schools in which a large percentage of the students are African American and from low-income families have much more difficulty in attracting and retaining skilled teachers than do other schools. And there's a paper in the volume by Susanna Loeb and her colleagues showing that not only is that the case for schools that have high percentages of low-income children, but it's also the case for schools that are in neighborhoods that exhibit a lot of crime. It's much more difficult to attract and retain skilled teachers. Also, as soon as teachers have enough seniority, they leave those schools. And one challenge with the problem that creates is investing in professional development to improve the quality of teaching in those schools doesn't have any payoff if the teachers leave. So again, through all of these mechanisms, this increase in residential segregation that resulted in increase in segregation of schools by income affects the way schools serving poor kids operate, with detrimental effects on the achievement of those children. So intergenerational stories. So how does all this impact on life chances for children? This is from a paper by the sociologist Michael Hout and one of his students in the volume. And what it shows is that if you starting in about 1950, the percentage of males who had more education than their parents was about 60%, and that continued almost until 1980. But that has fallen, and now less than 50% of males aged 25 have more education than their parents. Turning around the other side and ask, how about the number of males aged 25 who have completed less education than their parents did? Well, up until fairly recent decades, it was less than 10%. And that's, I think, is evident by that graph that Greg showed earlier of the rising educational attainments of Americans. It's now the case that more than 20% of males aged 25 have lower educational attainments than did their fathers. And the figures for our females are not quite so bad, but again, the percentage has grown. And one reason this matters is when we think about, one of the values Americans hold dear is that a child may grow up poor, but if the child works hard and gets a good education, his children or her children will not grow up poor. So educational opportunity is the key mechanism for intergenerational socioeconomic mobility. So to the extent that educational opportunities are thwarted, that puts in jeopardy this intergenerational mobility in income and socioeconomic status of which Americans historically have been so proud. Now, one question is, given the evidence that intergenerational mobility in education has declined, that is, as the numbers I show you there, there's a smaller percentage of young adults who had more education than their parents now than in the previous decades, and a greater percentage of less education than their parents than was in the past. You might think, well, gee, has that impacted on the extent of intergenerational mobility of income? That is the percentage of Americans who, has there been a decline in the percentage of Americans who have done better than their parents did economically? Unfortunately, the evidence on that for the United States is not completely clear. There are studies that show that's the case, and there are studies that indicate that's not the case. But one thing that is clear is that intergenerational mobility in income is lower in the United States today than it is in a number of other industrialized countries, including the UK, Sweden, and Finland. So if a child is growing up poor, the chances that his children will not grow up poor are a good deal better if you live in one of these other countries than if you live in the United States. I think relatively few Americans are aware of this. When Americans go to a European country and are criticized for the tremendous income inequality in the United States, Americans typically respond, yes, but even though a child grows up poor, his children will not. We're a country of opportunity. Well, that appears to be less the case today in the US than in a number of other industrialized countries. So, looking ahead, what does all this matter for our future as a nation? Well, again, this is a graph that Greg showed you earlier, where, again, it's disturbing because, as Greg mentioned, and Claudia Golden and Larry Katz explained so well in their book, The Race Between Education and Technology, increasing educational attainments have been the mechanism that has supported increases in economic growth, that has supported rising standards of living for generations of Americans. Now, if you look today, the U.S. has fallen from 1st to 19th among OECD countries in its high school graduation rate. It's not that the U.S. rate is lower than it was in the past. It's just about the same, at a little bit less than 4 out of 5 Americans graduating from high school, but rather it's grown in many other countries. Again, U.S. has fallen from 1st to 12th in its college graduation rates. And the U.S. is the only country where soon-to-retire workers have completed more education than are new workers entering the labor force. I mean, that's just a very striking and deeply disturbing pattern. So, what do we do about this? Now, I'm sure there are many different views in the room about how we want to deal with the challenge of growing income inequality. And again, we've argued that that has played an important role in contributing to the decline in educational opportunities for children from low-income families. But when you then think about what do we do about this, we would argue that you really need to focus particularly on improving opportunities for children from low-income families. And we see as promising strategies 3 different approaches. And Greg and I are involved in writing our own book now, and we're trying to learn about these strategies and write about them. We spent today learning about Boston's pre-K program. There's a very nice, very encouraging evaluation of the impact of that program done by Christine Weiland and Hiro Yoshikawa that shows that in fact high quality pre-K programs really can make a difference in giving low-income kids a strong start as they enter school. We also are learning about and are writing about effective strategies to improve elementary and high schools, looking particularly at an intervention at large scale in New York City, in which large comprehensive high schools that weren't working well at all were closed, and a competition was introduced under which educators could develop and implement designs for new small schools, and there's now been more than 200 of these small high schools opened in low-income areas in New York City, and the evaluation of that showing its impact on high school graduation rates for low-income kids is really quite encouraging. And we also are learning about programs to support low-income families better, and Greg talked a little bit about that evidence. So in conclusion, one of the things in trying to get attention for this work, we found that reporters are much more interested in writing about the current recession and its impact. And we've worked hard to try and make the case, yes, clearly the recession is deeply problematic, but you really need to look at these long-term trends in income inequality that are having quite a dramatic impact on educational opportunities for kids from low-income families, with enormous implications for the nation's future. So that's the case we're trying to make. I hope you're at least somewhat convinced. Thank you.
So, let me go back a second. The most important thing I want to say about this book is very short, which is it's a really good book. That is really good news, because the number of edited volumes about which I could say that, certainly I could count them on the fingers of one hand. This is not the norm for edited volumes, and this is a terrific one. I say that with particular passion because I put a lot of energy into persuading the board of the Spencer Foundation, composed of skeptics who kept saying, whoever thought of an edited volume ever made any difference, that this one would be different. And I was vindicated, so that's part of my reason for standing up here and telling you all this. That said, I want to, no, don't. I want to concentrate on 2 papers a little bit, and you'll see why in a moment. One is the paper by Sean Reardon, and the other is the one by Bailey and Dynarski. And they're 2 papers which Greg mentioned, I guess, and so did Dick. Both of these papers show that the disparity in children's outcomes by parental income widened over the period during which income inequality began to grow. So what else is new? Well, okay, here we go. The news in those papers, from my point of view, which is not stressed enough, I would say, by the authors, is that the disparities in children's test scores and in their years of schooling didn't just widen because income disparities between their parents widened. The other thing that happened is that the effect of the same income difference got much bigger over the same period of time. So it's one way to think about it is to say, well, if you thought about two families that incomes differed by a factor of 2, if it was a pure story of rising income inequality, then those two families shouldn't be any more different in the second period than the first, because if their families, those two families, let us pray. Is this unhappy? Let's see if we can calm it. But what you see going on here is that there's this big increase in the regression coefficient of income is one way to think about it, but just think of it as the effect of an income difference, however it's defined, gets bigger over time, independent of whether income is getting more unequal, or maybe not independent of that, but it's not obvious that the differences are driven simply by differences in parental income. Something else is going on to make income become more important over this period. I'm going to use the language of micro effects and macro effects to describe that. By micro effects, I just mean, what would you expect to have happen if nothing else changed except that income spread out more? And if you kind of work through the arithmetic doing this, the answer is you would expect the things that we see, but you wouldn't expect them to be anywhere near as great as they are. It's bigger than you would expect. What I want to stress here is that what that suggests is that there's something else going on, and that's what I'm going to call macro effects here. That is, something in the society as a whole is changing the effects of parental income on kids' outcomes. That can happen in a lot of different ways. It can change the relative willingness of richer and poorer parents to spend money on their kids in the way that the paper that Greg talked about indicated had happened. That is, the dispersion in what parents spend can go up more than their incomes dispersion goes up. It can happen because the cost of housing goes up more in a district with good schools than in a district with bad schools, making the costs of residential segregation higher. It can happen because the price of going to college goes up faster than incomes, so that a shrinking proportion of parents can afford to pay their children's college bills, and more kids need to borrow money or work often outrageously long hours in order to go to college. And lots of low-income kids think that it's risky to borrow money, and it's exhausting to try to do the amount of paid work while trying to compete academically in college. The other thing I should stress is that there are lots of other things that could cause this that have nothing to do with income inequality. We don't know what is really causing this. We don't have a story about how this works. But I'm going to tell you a story nonetheless. The story I'm going to tell is this. Let's look at how income inequality actually changed between 1969 and the present. So the first line shows you the most commonly used measure of income inequality, which is the Gini coefficient. And there are two things to notice here. The first is that almost all the increase occurs between 1969 and 1992. Between 1993 and 2008, it doesn't move much at all. The second is, it doesn't go up all that much. Now you might say, well, what does that prove? Since the Gini coefficient is something that nobody knows what it is, the fact that it only went up 13.7% might not seem to you to tell you much one way or the other. But I will give you a definition that you can use to think about this. If you imagine that you calculated the absolute difference in income between every possible pair of households in the United States, like a great big matrix, and you put all the households on the horizontal axis and all the ones on the vertical axis, and calculate those differences. And you add them up, divide, get the mean difference between every possible pair of households, and divide by the mean income, you get the Gini coefficient times 2. So the percentage increase in here is the increase in the absolute difference between households, random households, and compared to the increase in mean income. The assumption here is that as mean income increases, everything else is going to increase proportionately. That's not a very big increase. Now, the next line. Well, the next line tells you the story you're familiar with about the 99% and the 1%. And you can see that the increase in the share of the top 1% during this same period rose close to 80%. That's allowing for some errors in the way that the estimates are normally made. That is, it takes account of the fact that there was a change in the IRS code during the late 1980s that led a lot of people to report income as personal income instead of reporting it as small business income. I won't go there. The main thing to take away from the second line is most of that happened after 1993. Not much before. Now, the next two rows contrast what happens to all households and what happens to parents. We're really interested in what happens to parents because they're the group that should be driving what's happening to kids if the mechanism involved in all this is what's happening to parental income and what parents can buy and how stressed they are and all that. Well, if you look at that, you see two things that are important. The first is almost all the change is between 1969 and 1992. Now, that doesn't mean that all the effects are going to be between 1969 and 1992, because if the parents' incomes became more unequal and then stayed more unequal, which is what the next column is telling you, is there wasn't much change after that, it would be a while before all those effects fed through and all influenced the kids. But it does tell you that the timing is very different from the timing of the increase at the top. The last thing to notice here is that the big increase, the really big increase here, is not even in the top half of the distribution, it's in the bottom half of the distribution. It's the gap between the 10th percentile and the 50th percentile of the distribution for families that's really rising, and it's really rising in the first half of this period. And that's driven a lot by the change in the number of single moms, but it's also got other causes as well. So you have two different stories. Now, what is it I'm going to here? The big increase in micro effects, the direct effects of parental income, ought to come for the kids who are born, at least, in the 70s and 80s, and we should be working our way through to the end of that if that's the whole story. And in particular, we should be seeing this pulling apart of the bottom and the middle. At least in the National Assessment of Educational Progress, that's not what you see. What you see is convergence of the bottom and the middle for math, and no trend worth discussing for reading. That's a little puzzling. The other thing to say that might help explain that is that the census data on the bottom of the income distribution that I'm using here is not, it underestimates the gains in the incomes of poor families because it only looks at cash income It doesn't count food stamps. It doesn't count housing subsidies. It doesn't count Medicaid. It doesn't count the earned income tax credit, all of which grew a lot during this period when this ratio was going up. So it probably didn't go up as much as the chart suggests, but on the other hand, it did go up. All the tweaking I've done suggests that it went up some. So that's kind of an early story. Now let's come to the later story. The later story, I think, the story about what's happening since 1990, is, I think, a political story about what affected the importance of income. And I would give you a couple of examples. I won't try to spell this out in detail, but one example is what happened to tuition in public colleges and universities after 1990. Well, what happened is that it began to rise faster than the incomes of all but the more affluent families. So that the stress on a family of trying to pay for all this increased, and not surprisingly, the rate of increase in students going to college slowed down. The second political consequence that I would point to is that the political agenda of the country became completely paralyzed by the idea that it was impossible to raise taxes. No one has talked seriously about spending more overall certainly since the early 90s, hardly even then. It really goes back. Ronald Reagan changed the discourse, or Proposition 13 changed the discourse. Well, how would you account for this? Well, if you double the share of income going to the top 1%, you more than double the amount of the share of political spending, both on things that are trying to influence public opinion, public relations campaigns, think tanks, chairs endowed at universities by conservative foundations that have then a voice in who gets put into them, and also, of course, political contributions to elections. But I think actually that's probably less important than the change in the public discourse. I mean, if I had to choose between guessing what's the influence of Fox News and what's the influence of the amount of money that is put into election campaigns, I would guess it's greater for Fox News, or for the Tea Party for that matter. But the point here is that I think we need to be looking at this set of connections that might be driving this set of results that Greg and Dick and the papers in this volume spell out, I think, very convincingly, rather than just thinking about how does parental income do this. I'm not saying parental income doesn't do anything. Parental income pretty clearly matters. I will say it matters a little more in studies that use the experiments to which Greg referred than it seems to matter when you just look at survey data and say how much difference is there once you control a few things between people whose incomes differ by a factor of 2. I have no idea why that should be the case, but it's a quite consistent pattern and very puzzling. Okay, so I'm done, and now I'm going to yield up the floor and sit down. Or are we coming up here? Okay.
Thanks for these wonderful presentations. Can we turn on this? So I'll be moderating the questions and answers. Thanks for these wonderful presentations. But first I wanted to ask whether Greg and Dick had some response to Sandy's really thought-provoking comments.
They are indeed thought-provoking, as usual. You know, it's obviously hard to think about the political influence question. when Dick and I thought about ways in which this increasing residential segregation by income might be affecting school attainment, one obvious candidate was a political one, that if you had in a metropolitan area the rich increasingly living with the rich and the poor increasingly living with the poor, you might expect that those areas where that happened relatively more would have the greatest declines in support for public schools or public services in general. There have been 2 good studies that have shown that hasn't been the case, right? And it's quite surprising. But one possible explanation would be kind of a median voter explanation, that if income is indeed being concentrated at the top, then the median voter who's deciding things is getting a bit of a free ride because they're not having to pay as much of the increase as the people at the top. Now that's not the top 1%, right? And maybe there's a different process going on with that political influence. But to the extent that it's potentially a function of a broader set of changes in income distribution, it just doesn't seem to hold up. And I found that to be surprising. But it's not saying anything about the 1%.
It'd be fun to hear from these folks.
Yeah. So if anyone in the audience has a question, please come up to the microphones. And who wants to go first?
Can I retrieve my watch? Yeah.
Hi, Dan.
Looking at the charts.
Oh, sorry to interrupt. If you could introduce yourself.
Sure. My name is Dan Rothstein. I'm the co-director of the Right Question Institute. Looking at the charts, looking at the data, is quite sobering. And looking at the argument about the doubling of political influence has significant implications for then looking at the data again. And it seems to me that it requires reconceptualizing how we think about building capacity, because part of what we see happen is things being done to people. These are decisions being made, there's influence that's growing, and things are being done to people, and then everybody is trying to respond to that. And that happens all the time in the lives of low-income people. They have more than 100 million encounters a year with public institutions, with the welfare office, with the children's schools, with the housing authority. And in none of those, in very few of those encounters are they participating effectively in decisions at that level. So why would we expect that people who are not participating effectively at that level would be participating at any other level? And yet we continue with models of looking at how do we bring people over to participate in democracy on a high level or in decision-making on a higher level. And it seems to me that we could look at this data and we could ask a question about what is the role of public institutions, of direct frontline service agencies. How can they begin to build capacity in a way so that people can begin to actually participate in ways that they're not participating now? Because if not, I see the data as encouraging a certain sense of hopelessness. And looking at trying to promote more pre-K education reform. I mean, those are major endeavors, those are relevant, and I think you can actually look at the impact on families. But I think that we need to try to think bigger. How do we begin to look at the institutions that we have, the infrastructure of services that we have, and begin to think about how do we tap the capacity of frontline workers? Frontline workers are also victims of this kind of trend. How can they begin to be part of the solution? And we look at investment from external and from above, but how do we begin to look at what is it that we want from people at a micro level to be doing that can have an impact on the macro level? And so that's really the question I have for all of you, is what can be done at the micro level that can have an impact on the macro level?
Let me just say a few words in response. One is Dan Rothstein and his colleague Luz Santana have a wonderful new book that provides a lot of the answer to Dan's question. So I encourage you to read that book, which is a Harvard Educational Press book. But I think, we
If we had the answers, I just would have read the book. But,
well,
we didn't have that.
no,
answer.
but I think Greg and I spent this morning trying to learn about the Boston pre-K program, and one of the conversations, and as we learned, and Hiro or Christine can add to this if they care to, is that the director of the Boston pre-K program faced a question of how do I use very tight resources, and do I work on improving the quality of instruction in classrooms, or do I work on increasing role of parents? And he decided to do the first. And the argument was parents are clearly important, and a lack of knowledge of vocabulary and things that poor kids typically encounter when they come to school is an enormous handicap. But we haven't made very much progress on defining interventions that really improve parenting or alter parenting or support low-income families better. Now, I know your and Luz's approach is very different. That is, it's to empower those parents to improve their own capacity to act collectively, which I think is very hard. It's very important, but also very hard.
David?
Hi guys, my name's David Deming. I'm an assistant professor here at the Ed School. So I just had a question. I guess I kept thinking about the distinction between inequality in income and inequality in kind of earnings potential. And it seems like the strategies you would, the way you would think about those things is really different. So like one way you could decrease inequality is just increase the top marginal tax rate the level it was at 40 years ago, and you would decrease inequality, but you wouldn't actually do anything about the kind of the skill distribution in the population. So it would be a strategy to reduce income inequality, but wouldn't actually affect kind of the inequality in potential earnings. And so it seems like, based on the focus of the chapters in your book, you're really thinking about the question of inequality in skills or in potential earnings. And so I was just wondering if you had any thoughts about how you could break that down, how much of it is due to kind of policy changes, things like tax rates, things like something like tuition increases, I would think of as something that affects sort of both, but really is more of a case of affecting kind of mechanical earnings inequality than potential inequality. So I just wondering if you had thoughts on that distinction.
It's a good question. When we talk about the solutions in the current book we're writing, it's really departing from an analysis of what went wrong to try to look at how to make it right, especially from the point of view of how to promote higher levels of skills in the next generation, right? So this isn't answering your question, but it seemed to us that the best way of thinking about the policy set was not so much in trying to diagnose what went wrong, but to think about ways, cost-effective ways of investing in either families or schools in ways that whatever has gone wrong can be remediated so that we can boost skills of low-income kids, at least in the future.
Can I just follow? So at the risk of turning my question to a long comment, let me make it a little more precise. So let's say we took a country like Finland or Sweden, and we took their kind of tax policy, kind of structural things that affect the income distribution in those countries, and we superimpose that on the U.S. So the question is, if we did that in 40 years ago,
Right.
how much would that get us to look like the income distribution in Sweden? And then what if we did it today? Would that look different? That is, how much of this inequality is a function of policy, and how much of it is actual skill distribution? And has that changed over the last 40 years, do you think?
It seems to me, it's unclear to me why a change in tax policy doesn't change earnings potential.
So,
That is, you are paid your marginal product if you're an economist. That includes the taxes that are paid. So the more of that goes into the government's pocket, the lower your earnings potential is. And you squeeze the distribution of take-home pay, even if the distribution of, quote, skills
is... But that doesn't affect
is...
kind of your potential, like what you could, that's not a change in the distribution of skills in the pocket. That's just
No,
kind of
but it's a change in your potential earnings. It's not a change in the distribution of skills. I agree about that.
Yeah.
And if you believe that all those hedge fund managers really are earning what they're getting paid, then you've got a big problem, because we have no solution to that. But I'm not convinced by that line of argument. I sort of have the feeling that they're the people who brought us the present catastrophe rather than the people who have earned all those huge bonuses.
Okay.
Hi there. I'm Jenny Case. I'm a visiting fellow at the Du Bois Institute from the University of Cape Town. And thanks for a very thought-provoking presentation. Really, there's a lot of things to think about there. I think I'm really continuing from the previous speaker, because I haven't read your book yet, so I apologize, I'm missing something. But in your final slide, I think it was Dec who presented your sort of policy recommendations. I was quite surprised, actually, by the stance you took there, where you said that obviously reducing inequality, give up on that or not, but sort of that won't be cost effective, but stick with school interventions. And in a way, I see in Christopher's response an implicit challenge to that, because especially if one's doing cross-country comparisons. So I think it comes down to where you locate causality for these effects. And I think, there may be deeper... maybe that's a bigger question, but maybe let me just sort of stick it at the level of maybe inviting you to respond a bit more to what I see as Christopher's challenge, or in fact to define why that first move was considered cost ineffective. I guess it's cost for who, I suppose. If I've made myself clear.
Yeah, I think we, in thinking about this, I decided it made more sense to trying to have as broad an impact to this book as we could, to make the case for the investments that have been shown to really improve life chances for kids from low-income families, and emphasize the importance of undertaking those investments at a large scale. Of course, if you are able to convince a broad number of people that that's important, then you have to raise the question, how do we pay for them? And so that's a way, to some sense, to let's start with what we really needs to be done to assure prosperity in future generations, as well as social justice. But the constituency for the former is a lot larger than the constituency for the latter. And then talk about, well, how are we going to pay for these things?
But I also think you need to be realistic about the political constraints. And if you think back to welfare reform, for example, in the United States 20 years ago, a lot of liberals clung to the idea that about welfare rights and the importance of maintaining unconditional cash assistance for low-income families. And it was simply not in the cards in terms of public opinion that that system would continue. And the question was, is it possible for a welfare reform to set up a new set of norms and really a new social contract that would provide families, low-income families, with considerably more resources than they now had. because it was clear that if you were just relying on unconditional cash transfers, that was going nowhere, right? So, one maybe overly optimistic take, at least it happened in some states, was that the federal government and the states anteed up a lot of extra money that went to low-income families, but under the conditions that were palatable for the majority of American voters, and that was to condition the payments on work. So, I think now we have to be realistic about, if you think about the political debate, if we were to maintain the current level of inequality, we'd be doing well, given all the kind of tax plans that are being floated. And, Dick and I are both getting old, and we want to see policies that have a real chance of producing short-term impacts. And if you have a scenario where the broader political discussion can be reshaped in a way that focuses on inequality that will produce a change in the distribution of income, then I'd like to hear that. But I think we're trying to focus on proven policies that are really going to make a concrete difference in the short run for American kids.
I think we're all whistling in the dark here. That is, I think that it's true that the likelihood that we will redistribute income dramatically in the foreseeable future is low. But I think it's equally true that the likelihood that we'll have universal pre-K programs paid for by any government that I can think of is equally low. Like, none of us are going to live to see either of those. So that leaves me thinking, well, I could say, well, I'm for both, which is true. Or I could say, this is more important than that one, when neither is going to happen, and then who cares? But I don't quite see how with the present distribution of income and the present set of attitudes that have flowed from it, we're going to get any of these other things either, which makes me really pessimistic, but then that doesn't keep me from saying what I'd like to see happen.
We unfortunately are only going to have time for one more question, though the speakers will hang around for a bit, so you were next.
Right. Jerron Campbell, I'm a D1 in the EDLD program. Looking at the chart that you had, where you had the black-white test score gap decreasing and the income gap increasing, I have data that shows that if you break the test score data, like for major cities, up by demographic group, the black people are always pretty much at the bottom of that. And if you add the low socioeconomic line to that chart, blacks are still below that line. They're the only ones below that line. So when I see a chart like that, it seems that the emphasis is trying to be put on income versus race, when I'm not sure if, as a nation, that is what's going to be most effective, at least for blacks. Now, I guess in some sense, maybe the people who are have the goal of producing a permanent underclass for blacks have achieved it, and therefore we want to move on to something else. Or maybe I heard that the courts have made it harder to use race. Maybe income status is more easier to attack in terms of trying to create equity in our schools. But I don't know if that's accurate, to say that the test score, black-white test score gap has decreased. I mean, you look at ACT, for instance. I do a lot of ACT work in Detroit, and for the last decade, only blacks and whites and Asians have increased on the ACT, whereas blacks and Latinos have gone down. So that gap is increasing over time. And as you know, the ACT is directly correlated to college admission, scholarships, which of course ties to college completion, which ties to life outcome, right? So it seems that race is still a bigger factor, than income gap. So I was just wondering what you had to say in terms of that.
Yeah, so not much has happened, I agree, in terms of the level of the black-white test score gap over the last 15 or 20 years. If you there's another version of that gap graph that I show sometimes, where if you actually look at the test score increases at the top and bottom of the distribution, test scores are going up at the top and bottom. They're going up faster at the top than they are at the bottom. If you track the bottom 20% and then you track blacks, back in 1970, blacks are indeed lower in terms of average test scores than the threshold for the bottom 20%. But over the next 30 years, you actually get blacks increasing to a point where they're significantly above the 20% threshold. Now, saying that, being above the 20% threshold isn't saying that we should be complacent about the black-white gap. Looking back prior to 15 years before now, there really was substantial progress with school desegregation and increasing school quality for blacks, which is, to say that if you really do have the political will, you can make a difference in groups' achievement. But it is the case that this gap is actually smaller for black versus white than for high income versus low income. But it's not to say that being now above the 20% threshold is anything to cheer much about.
Let's thank our panelists. Unfortunately, we're at the end of our time.
Thank you.